My name is Jeff, and this story is about one of the first times that my parents left me home alone. I was probably 12 or 13 at the time. I would be left on my own from around the age of 10. I guess that's a little young for most, but that's what we did. My mom would always tell me not to answer the door or phone when I was alone. However, I would break the rules sometimes. Usually just to answer the phone, because if it was one of my friends, then I didn't want to miss out. My father was away on business at the time, and my mom was out doing something. I can't remember what. It was about 8 p.m., and I was in the living room watching TV. Then I heard the doorbell ring. I ignored it at first, and continued watching. Then it rang again. I got up and walked to the front of the house. I wasn't going to answer it. I was just curious, and I thought I could peek out the window and see who it was. I carefully moved the curtains aside and pressed my face against the glass. He was a middle-aged man in some kind of uniform. He looked like a mechanic or some kind of repairman. He wore a blue-collared shirt and a name tag, but I couldn't read it. I was watching him for a few seconds when he looked over at me. I was caught. He smiled and waved at me, then said, "Hey there, son. We got a report of a gas leak. Can you let me in?" I quickly closed the curtains and took a step away from the window. I knew that I wasn't supposed to open the door when I was alone, but if there was a gas leak, then that could be bad. I reluctantly turned the deadbolt and opened the door. The man was really quite friendly and jovial. He told me that he needed to come in to check the gas lines. I told him that I'm not supposed to be alone with strangers, and he asked me if he could talk to my mom or dad. That was when a chill ran down my spine. I realized that if I admitted to being alone, then he could do whatever he wanted. He was probably fishing for information as soon as I opened the door. I tried to think of a lie, but the best I could come up with was to say that my dad was in the shower. That would only buy me a few minutes. Tension built while we stood there, pretending that everything was all right. I almost started crying at one point. Then I saw one of my neighbors across the street, walking her dog. She immediately noticed me standing there on the porch with a strange man, and must have known that something was wrong. As soon as the man saw her coming, he turned around and walked back to his van, then drove off. My neighbor asked me who that was. I told her what had happened, and that he was with the gas company, and that there was a leak. Then she calmly told me to stay in the house, while she called my mom. My mom rushed home, and when she heard what happened, she called the police. It was then that I realized how serious the situation was. We never found out who that guy was, but when my mom called the gas company, they said they hadn't sent anyone, and that there was no leak. I'm a 27-year-old woman, and I used to live in a shared house with a few of my friends from college. It had been about 5 years since we graduated, but we all managed to find work in the same city, so we decided to move in together. This story took place during Thanksgiving of last year. My roommates had all gone to spend the occasion with their families. I, however, don't have the best relationship with my parents, so I stayed and had the house to myself. Besides, there was a work event that I wanted to go to, just a little get-together at a local bar. We had a few drinks and talked about work for a while, and after 2 hours, I decided to call it a night early. I decided that I'd rather watch some Netflix and go to sleep at a reasonable hour. I called an Uber and stood on the sidewalk waiting. The car pulled up and I got in, taking the back seat. The driver was about 45 years old with a bald head. He was very friendly and talkative, and although I didn't really feel like talking, I didn't want to be rude. He asked me some mundane questions about what I was up to that night. I told him that I was out with my coworkers and that my roommates were away for Thanksgiving. He laughed awkwardly, then said, "So you're home alone?" Then he looked back at me with a smile. I immediately got a feeling in the pit of my stomach when I realized what I had done. I should have never told a stranger that I was home alone, especially because I had already given him my address. I tried not to dwell on it though. He was probably harmless, I thought. We eventually made it to my house, and I got out of the car. I walked to my front door and stepped inside. Once I locked the front door, I peered out the window and breathed a sigh of relief when I saw the car drive away. I went to my room and got into bed. I was watching something on my laptop when I heard a noise from downstairs. It was a long creaking sound, like somebody was opening a door really slowly. My stomach turned when I realized that I couldn't remember if I had locked the back door. I didn't even check. I quickly closed my laptop and placed it on my nightstand. Then I walked to my door and stood there listening. At this point, I wasn't sure if there was anyone in the house, so I wanted to make sure before calling the police. With my ear firmly pressed against the door, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. Someone was in the house. I almost panicked, but somehow managed to stay in control. I moved my dresser in front of the door, but when I did, the footsteps became louder and quicker. Now I realized that doing so revealed my location in the house. He was coming for me. I ran into my closet and dialed 911. Whispering into the phone, the operator told me to stay calm and that the police would be there in 5 minutes. 5 minutes sounded like an eternity, but I knew I could make it. Just then, I started to hear pounding on my bedroom door. Neither of us said a word, but the door was opening. The dresser wouldn't hold him for long. Then I shouted out that the police were on their way. I guess that was enough to scare him, and he stopped trying to get in. That was when the sweet sound of police sirens emerged from the distance. A few long minutes later, a female officer knocked on my door and said that it was safe to come out. She told me that they had arrested the guy and had him in custody. I then told her about the creepy experience I had with the Uber driver earlier in the evening. It was then that we walked out to the street. I saw my tormentor sitting there in the back of a police car. It was him, my Uber driver from that night. I have no idea what would have happened if I hadn't heard the door opening that evening. What if I had gone to sleep earlier? Either way, this was the most terrifying experience of my life, and if you're ever home alone, whatever you do, don't tell a stranger. When I was growing up, my mom used to work the late shifts as a nurse at a retirement home. Her shifts would start at 6 p.m. and go until 2 a.m. She used to get a babysitter for my brother Andrew and I, but as soon as we were old enough, we would be on our own. That was fine with us because we felt really mature and grown up having the house to ourselves. Neither my brother nor I were really troublemakers by anybody's standards, and we were actually pretty good students. We'd get our homework done on our own, then usually just watch TV and hang out afterwards. We were sitting on the couch in front of the TV. Our living room was at the front of the house, and there was a window next to the TV, so we could see the street and sidewalk out of our peripheral vision while we watched. It was a quiet night, but there were a few cars passing by, and also 1 or 2 people walking down the street. I eventually started to notice something strange. I had seen the same van pass our window at least 3 times. It was an older gray minivan, probably from the late 90s. I turned my attention away from the TV and started watching the street more closely. After I saw it another time, I told my brother. He hadn't noticed because he was focused on the show. The both of us sat there, looking out the window, and sure enough, we saw the same van another 2 times within 3 minutes. This guy was just driving back and forth on our street. It seemed strange, but we didn't worry too much at first, because maybe he was lost. We noticed it pass by another few times, and started to get concerned. Both of us were now fixated on the window, but after another few minutes, it seemed to stop. We were both relieved and went back to the TV. After a few episodes of whatever we were watching, it was starting to get late, and my brother and I decided to go to bed. Andrew went upstairs, while I got up from the couch and walked past the window. That's when I noticed something terrifying. That old van was parked in front of our house on the street, just out of view of where we were sitting. I quickly closed the curtains, then slid them open a crack to peek through. There was a man sitting in the front seat of the van. Had he just been sitting there this whole time? I thought. I couldn't really make out any details about him, but one thing did strike me. His eyes had a seriously disturbing look. The reflection of the bright streetlights gave them an evil, yellowish glow. I don't think he saw me behind the curtains, but he was definitely looking at our house. I called up to Andrew and told him to come downstairs. He looked out the window to see the man sitting there in the driver's seat of the van. "I think he saw me," my brother cried. We were terrified, and after some discussion, we decided to call our mom at work. My brother and I took pride in being able to take care of ourselves, so we didn't like to bother mom at work, but this was serious. As soon as we told her what was happening, she raced home. Less than 15 minutes later, I watched her car pull into the driveway. I then turned my attention to the spot where I saw the van, and it was gone. He had taken off. Probably as soon as my mom got home. We never found out who that guy was or why he was there. My mom did call the police, but there was really nothing they could do. We didn't even get a license plate number. This incident shook all three of us to the core, and for another year or so after, my mom started getting a babysitter again. This happened a long time ago, so I apologize if some things do not seem clear. I've removed this experience from my memory for reasons that will become obvious, but now I've decided to tell people what happened, because I realize it's not something I should hide. Me and my brother Ron were home alone, and we were in my room watching the NFL on TV. We were screaming at the screen whenever our team did something stupid. We were 40 minutes into the game. The quarterbacks were messing around, and out of frustration, Ron slammed his fist into the remote, turning off the television by accident. I said, "What the hell?" and turned the TV back on. As the screen loaded back up, we heard fast-paced footsteps downstairs. Ron and I quickly turned our heads to the bedroom door. I turned down the volume so we could hear the noises more clearly. "I think someone's inside," Ron said. I could hear the stutter in his voice. He was anxious. "No, it's probably just the dog," I replied. Ron, however, was a lot more cautious. He walked over to the door and locked it. Then I realized that the click it made would have alerted the intruder, if there was one. At the time, though, I brushed it off as the Jack Russell Terrier. But we heard more footsteps. Ron whispered, "That's not the dog." Ron being nervous put me on edge, so I agreed with him, and we turned off the bedroom lights. Ron ran around the room, trying to find some sort of object that we could use as a weapon. I sat next to the door, with my ear placed on the wall. The doors were thin, so if there was anyone inside the house, I would hear. Nothing happened. It was just dead silence. Ron had his phone ready, in case we needed to dial 911. I laid on my chest and looked through the gap under the bedroom door. I didn't notice anything at first, but on closer inspection, I could just barely make out a pair of faded boots down the upstairs hall. I felt my hands shaking as I pushed myself back up to my feet. I tiptoed over to Ron, who was waiting anxiously for information. "Someone's here," I whispered as low as I could. Ron's face went pale, and he stared into nothingness. At one point, I thought he was going to black out on me. I pulled Ron over to our window. I quietly opened it and looked down to the grass, 2 stories below. Ron was still in a different world, as if he'd blocked himself out from reality, leaving the responsibility to me. I tried not to pay much attention to him, and instead focused on our escape. I took Ron's phone out of his hand as he crouched on the carpet. He had installed one of those apps where only specific fingerprints could enter the phone. I took his hand, which was shockingly cold, and held his pointer finger onto the screen. I jumped out of my skin when the phone let out a loud beep, and all of a sudden, I could hear the footsteps running straight to the bedroom door. I quickly typed in 911 and put one leg out the window. I heard loud thumps on my bedroom door and shouting. He was shouting, "I'm going to kill you." I climbed out the window and landed on the porch roof. Then I shouted back to Ron for him to follow me. Ron stood up quickly and stumbled out the window. He landed on the roof beside me, and I forced the window shut again. "We need to jump," I said. I could hear faint thumping behind the walls. He was struggling to get into our room. I jumped off the porch roof and sprained my ankle. Ron was wobbling on the edge, clearly hesitant. "Quick," I whispered. I avoided shouting because the intruder would have known that we were outside. Ron touched his chest, head, right shoulder, and left shoulder, making the cross, and then he jumped. He rolled when he landed on the ground, and when he got up, he rubbed his neck, and then we ran away. We had run a good 6 blocks before I realized that we had left the dog behind. Suddenly, I heard a faint voice in my jean pocket. I pulled out the phone and heard a woman asking if we were still there. It was the 911 operator. I told her that we needed the cops immediately, and she told us to stay on the line and that the cops were en route to the house. I burst into tears from what had just happened, but my main concern was for my dog. I talked to the operator as both me and Ron slowly walked back to the house. We heard the siren and felt weight lifted from our shoulders. I sat in my chair on the porch with Ron in a squat position beside me. We were both waiting anxiously to come face to face with the intruder. 4 cops came out, but they didn't have the guy. They did, however, have Lewis. Lewis was my dog. I stood up and took him from the officer, holding him close. I kissed his head and patted his back. I sat back down in the chair and placed Lewis on my lap, still hugging him and apologizing for leaving him behind. The cops explained that there was no one inside, and there was nothing stolen either. In fact, they explained that there was nothing that would have proven someone had invaded our property at all. They never found the guy, but I can assure you, I haven't had a good night's sleep ever since. Every night I lock my door and keep my dog with me in my room. Ron installed some CCTV cameras in the house not long after, and ever since, nothing similar has happened. My name is Kyle, and I live in a haunted house in Edmonton, Alberta. My mom and brother thought so anyway. I used to be skeptical that the house was haunted. That is until something happened to me personally. I'm 19 now, but this story took place when I was 17, in the middle of August. First off, I'll tell you some of the events that happened to my mom and brother before the event that happened to me. My mom and brother have both had cases of sleep paralysis in the house, which has never happened to me before we moved there. They both told me that their experiences went like this. They felt like someone was slowly pushing down or sitting on their chests while they were sleeping, and they'd wake up with no one on top of them. They were unable to speak or move, which is quite scary when you think about it. Another thing that has happened to both my mom and my brother is that while they were sleeping in their beds, something would suddenly yank off the covers and scare the absolute crap out of them. My brother has had this happen to him multiple times, whereas my mom has only had it happen to her once. Now that you know the prior events, I'll tell my story. It was the weekend, and my mom had left to take my brother to soccer practice, while I was home in my room playing video games with my buddy online. After we had stopped playing, I turned off Discord and said goodbye. Then I turned off my PC and sat on my bed. I opened up YouTube to watch some videos, because my favorite YouTuber had just posted. While I was laying on my bed, I heard some noises from the kitchen. It sounded like dishes in the sink rattling. That was odd, because I was home alone at the time. I sat there for a while listening, and then I began to hear the cabinets being opened and closed. I was naive at the time, and I just figured it was my mom and brother back early from soccer. So I peeked my head around the corner and walked down the hall to see if anyone was there. To my shock, it wasn't them. Instead, I saw a black mist-like shadow person standing at the end of the hall that leads to the kitchen. I was in complete awe of what I was seeing, and I just stood there looking at the thing, unable to process what was in front of me. After what seemed like a minute or two, I dipped back into my room and slammed the door shut. I pressed my whole body against it to keep it closed. I remembered that my phone was on my bed, so I slid over to it and texted my mom. I asked her what to do. She told me to get out of that house and go stay with a friend until she gets back home with my brother. I looked out my door and down the hallway to see if the coast was clear. Lucky for me, it was. I gathered all my courage and grabbed my longboard. Then I booked it down the hall and out the front door of my house. I grabbed my shoes on the way and stopped at the end of the driveway to put them on. Then I plopped my longboard on the ground and started off, almost wiping out on the way. I rode over to my friend's house who was previously playing games with me. Once I got there, he let me in and I told him what I saw. To my surprise, he actually believed me. He told me that one time when he was staying at my house, he saw something similar in the kitchen. He woke up in the middle of the night on the couch, which was in the living room next to the kitchen. He saw a dark figure standing in there, staring down the hallway towards the bedrooms. Apparently he thought it was a dream, since he was still half asleep and groggy. So he didn't say anything about it the next day. He just went on with whatever we were doing. Once my mom had gotten home, we decided to enter the house. As soon as we stepped inside, we could tell that someone or something had been there, because all the dishes were out of place and the cabinets were hanging open. We decided not to stay the night there, and we went to our cousin's place instead. They lived 15 minutes away in Sherwood Park. When we got home, everything was back to normal, except that the lights in the house were on. Ever since this happened, I've been a firm believer in ghosts and the supernatural. This just happened an hour ago, and I'm still spooked. Me and my best friend were home alone, and we had been for a while. Every time he comes over, we go to the woods by my house, and it's normally uneventful. We would throw some rocks and break some sticks, harmless fun, but this time, something else happened. We went outside to go to the woods, and nothing much happened on the way, but when we got there, something was off. Everything was dark, tons of trees had been knocked down, and the entire place was not like I remembered it. We kept going anyway, still having our usual harmless fun. At one point, my friend turned to me and said that we should go back. I looked at my phone to check the time, and I saw that we'd only been there for 30 minutes. I wanted to stay longer, because it would be a few hours before anyone would want us back home. We continued on, finding strange things, like an old crushed Mountain Dew can, probably 10 or 20 years old, and a toy boat that had been completely destroyed by wind and water. It was probably even older than the can. Our plan was to go further in than we had ever been before, which wouldn't be very hard for us, because we hadn't been that deep. After walking for a while, we came to a landmark that I knew. It marked the deepest point that I'd ever been in the woods. It was a bridge built on a log that had fallen over a river in the middle of the forest. I had seen it before, however, one thing was different. There was something sitting on top of it. It was small, and it resembled the head of an animal. When we got closer and got a good view of it, I could tell that it was a deer skull, pearly white and clean, sitting on the bridge. I had no clue who put it there, and where the rest of the deer was. On the other side of the river, there was a huge hill with a creepy small house on top of it. When we were looking around, I heard a creak or some kind of high-pitched noise from up towards it. We got spooked and began to run. I could hear my friend scream behind me. We both kept running, and once we reached the edge of the woods, we stepped onto the road. I asked him why he screamed, and he said that he heard footsteps next to him. We quickly made our way home, and when we got there, the garage door was open. Not knowing if it was left open or not, we ran inside and locked the door. I checked the house and turned the alarm on. We were still home alone, and I wished my parents would come back. Now we're still sitting here, and it's been nearly 2 hours since. I can't shake the feeling of fear that those eerie woods left me with. I was home one night, alone in the house, while my parents and my brother were at my brother's baseball game. I wasn't into sports, so I decided to stay home and play video games. But as I sat in my quiet room, I began to hear a faint knock on the door downstairs. It was strange, because we had a doorbell. I thought it might be someone just mistaking our house for someone else's. But then I heard the knock on the back door as well. I made my way downstairs to investigate. I peeked through the window, but I couldn't see anything. I walked down the hall towards the back of the house, and when I reached the back door, I saw him. An older man with a gray beard and flannel shirt was standing on our back porch. He saw me and immediately tried to convince me to let him in. But I wasn't born yesterday, so I refused. He looked like an average everyday person, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel like he was hiding something sinister. As I turned around to walk away, he called out to me,
"I know you're alone in there."
Suddenly, he began to pound on the door, trying to break it down. I panicked and ran back upstairs, locking myself in my dad's office. I could still hear him trying to break down the door, but I managed to grab the phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I could barely get the words out. My voice was shaking with fear. The man was still trying to break down the door. I could hear his grunts and the splintering of wood as he put his full weight into it. The police arrived quickly, but the man had already fled. My parents were relieved when they got home and heard what happened. They were scared for my safety, but grateful that I had managed to keep myself safe. The man was caught and arrested the next day. I knew I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation, and it made me realize the danger that can come from the most unexpected places. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump. I kept thinking about the man and how he tried to break into my house. I couldn't understand why he had targeted me and why he had come to my place. The police had assured me that it was just a drifter, someone who was wandering the streets and had picked my house at random. But something about that didn't sit right with me. The next day, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I did some digging on my attacker. I found out that he had a criminal record, mostly petty crimes, but there were a few more serious offenses. I knew that there was something to this man's attack. It felt too personal, too targeted. I started to search for news articles, looking for any connection between the man and my family. And that's when I found it. It was about a robbery of a local business. The man had been arrested for holding the store clerk at gunpoint. The store was only a few blocks from my house, and I found out that my mother was a witness in the attack. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This man had targeted my house because of my mother. He had recognized her and come to take revenge for being caught and arrested. I couldn't believe that my family had been put in such a dangerous situation because of a random act of violence a few years ago. I immediately called the police and shared my findings with them. They were shocked and promised to look into it further and provide us with any extra protection. But the damage had already been done. My family and I were left to deal with the aftermath of the attack. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, paranoid that the man would come back for us. My parents decided to install a security system, and we started to be more cautious about who we let into our home. We also started to carry pepper spray, and I put a panic button app on my phone. The incident left a deep impact on me. I started to have trouble sleeping, and I would often find myself checking the locks on the windows multiple times before going to bed. My parents tried to reassure me that we were safe now, and that the man was in custody, but the fear was still there. It's been a few months since the incident, and although the fear has subsided, it's still there, lurking in the back of my mind. This experience has taught me to never let my guard down, and always trust my instincts. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind you would see in an old horror movie. I was a boy of 10, home alone for the night while my parents were out of town. I had begged them to let me stay home alone, promising that I'd be responsible and not break any rules. As the night went on, I started to regret my decision, though. The wind howled outside, and the rain beat against the windows. I tried to keep myself occupied by watching TV, but every time a commercial came on, I heard strange noises coming from outside. I tried to tell myself that it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somebody was watching me. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that the storm would pass and I'd be able to sleep through the night. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers over my chin, but I had the feeling that there was somebody in the house with me. I heard strange whispers and footsteps, but when I turned on the light, there was nobody there. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was too strong. I was sure there was someone in the house, just outside the door. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. Just when I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a sound, and it sent chills down my spine. It was the sound of someone trying to turn my doorknob. I lay there frozen, as the doorknob slowly turned, and then it creaked open. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I couldn't see it, then it couldn't see me. But then I heard it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer to my bed. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted upright in my bed and screamed, "Who's there?" But there was no answer. The footsteps stopped, and the door closed, making a large bang. I sat there shaking for what felt like hours. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare go to the door to see if someone was really there either. In the morning, I told my parents about the strange noises and the footsteps, but they laughed it off as my imagination. They said that the storm must have just made the house creak, and that I was probably dreaming. But I knew what I had heard, and I believed that there was someone there that night watching me. From that night on, I never felt truly alone. I would hear strange noises and see shadows moving in the corner of my eyes. I never found out who or what it was that night. Everyone thought it was just my imagination, but I know it was real. I grew up in a typical suburban neighborhood. The streets were lined with identical houses, each with manicured lawns and white picket fences. My best friend was a boy named Joey, who was a year older than me and lived a few houses down. Joey was a bit of a troublemaker, always getting into mischief and causing trouble. But I couldn't help but be drawn to his charismatic personality and adventurous spirit. One night, I sat alone in my house, and there was a knock at my door. It was Joey, and he was accompanied by two older boys. They introduced themselves as Dave and Colin, and they looked to be a few years older than Joey. I let them into the house, feeling a bit uneasy, but wanting to fit in with the older guys. Once inside, Dave and Colin made themselves at home, lounging on the couch and helping themselves to snacks from the kitchen. I tried to make conversation, but they didn't seem too interested in talking. Instead, they began to argue amongst themselves, their voices growing louder and more heated. Suddenly, Dave pulled out a knife. I froze in shock as Dave and Colin began to fight. They were rolling around on my living room floor. I could see blood, but I didn't know who it was coming from. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. Just as I thought things couldn't get any worse, Joey stepped in. He grabbed the knife from Dave and helped me kick them both out of the house. They refused to go to the hospital, and neither of them wanted to call the police. I was left to clean up the mess they had left, and my mind was racing with fear and confusion. I scrubbed the blood from the floor and tried to put the living room back into order. I was really scared that my parents would find out, and I'd get in trouble. I realized that sometimes the people who you allow into your life can surprise you in the worst ways. From that day on, I made sure to choose my friends more carefully, and never put myself in such a dangerous situation again. I was around 12 years old when my parents started leaving me home alone without a babysitter. It was really exciting at first to have the feeling of freedom, but something really scary happened one time. My parents were out one evening, and I was alone watching TV in the living room when I heard the phone ring. I picked it up, but there was no one there, just silence. As soon as I hung up the phone, I heard the doorbell ring. I slowly walked over to the door, but I wasn't going to answer it. I just wanted to check who was there. When I got there, there was nobody. Just then, I heard the back window smash. I froze. After my initial shock wore off, I ran out the front door and down the street to my friend's house. Once I was safe, I called my parents, and they called the police. My parents came home as soon as they could, and the police were already there. They searched the house, and we learned that we had been robbed blind. The police officers told us that the person who broke in must have known that I was alone. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. Every time the phone rang, or someone came to the door, I would jump. I had nightmares about that break-in, and I would wake up in a cold sweat. My parents told me that I was safe, but I was still scared. One day, my parents received a phone call. It was the police. They had caught the person who broke into our house. They said it was someone who had been watching the neighborhood and must have seen my parents leave. He knew I was home alone, and then he saw his chance to break in. I was relieved to know that the person was caught, but I was still really scared all the time. I was no longer excited about being home alone, and for about a year after, my parents started hiring a babysitter again. But it wasn't long before I was too old for a babysitter, and from then on, I always made sure to keep my guard up. I arrived home one day after school. No one else was there. It was a nice spring day, so I left the main door open, but just the screen door was closed and unlocked. I grew up in a small town, so crime was pretty much non-existent for break-ins. I put my dog on his leash in the backyard so he could do what dogs do, and then I went back inside. I sat on the carpet in the living room watching TV. When a commercial break came on and the TV screen went blank, I saw a large figure right behind me. My anxiety went through the roof. My heart sank to the bottom of my stomach. My throat tightened up. It was hard to breathe when I first noticed the figure. Even though it was merely seconds, time seemed to slow down. As I turned my head, several thoughts went through my head. Why didn't my dog bark at the intruder? Right, he's tied up outside. With my head half turned towards the intruder, I could see in my peripheral vision that it wasn't a person, but a black animal. Then I was thinking that a bear had entered my home and was going to attack me. My heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. I was fully looking at the animal, and to my relief, it wasn't a bear. It was my neighbor's dog. He was panting and giving me a puppy smile. Oh my God, I was so relieved. He must have gotten free, and since I didn't fully latch the screen door, the big mutt was able to just push the door open, and he wandered in. I walked him over to my neighbor, and we laughed about the incident. But I'll never forget that moment of terror. Thankfully, it was the best case scenario, and I always latched the screen door closed after that. I never thought it would happen to me. I always heard stories of kids being left home alone and something horrible happening, but I never thought I'd be one of them. I was 13 years old, and my parents had gone out of town to visit family. It was summer, so I didn't have school either. I had a brother, but he was away at a friend's cottage at the time. My parents left me in charge of the house, and I was thrilled. Finally, I had some freedom. However, freedom came with responsibility, and I soon realized that being home alone was not as fun as I thought it would be. The first night was uneventful. I spent most of it watching TV and eating junk food. But in the morning, I noticed that all the patio furniture in the backyard was thrown into our pool. I was shocked. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, and I didn't know who could have done it. It wasn't terrifying or anything, and I figured it was just neighborhood kids goofing around, but I didn't know why they targeted us. I pulled everything out of the pool and brushed off the incident. The next day was more of the same, video games and TV. Then I got bored and started snooping around the house. I went into my brother's room. My brother was 2 years older than me, and he was always getting into trouble. I poked around in his closet, curious to find what he was hiding. Maybe cigarettes or something. In the bottom drawer of his dresser, there was a false bottom with a hidden compartment. In it, I found a gun and a large sum of money. I was shocked and I stumbled back. Then I looked around some more, and I found drugs hidden there as well. I had no idea that my brother was involved in drugs, and I didn't know what to do. Then I remembered the incident with the patio furniture from the other day. What seemed like a harmless prank started to look like an ominous threat. If my brother had a gun, then he must have thought there was some reason that he might need it. I started to feel very alone and vulnerable. I sat in my brother's room for a while, contemplating my options. I could keep quiet and pretend that I never saw anything, or I could tell my parents. I knew my parents would be angry with my brother, and I didn't want to get him in trouble. However, after much deliberation, I knew that telling my parents was the right thing to do. I couldn't let my brother continue down this dangerous path. I called my mom and told her everything. I could hear the disappointment in her voice. She told me to stay in the house and not to open the door for anyone. They were going to come home early and deal with my brother. I spent the next few hours sitting in my room, waiting for my parents to come home. I was anxious and scared, but I knew I had done the right thing. When my parents finally arrived, they were furious. They called my brother and yelled at him over the phone. Then they searched his room. They found the gun, the money, and drugs. My parents had no choice but to get the police involved. Since he was under 18, he was considered a minor and avoided having a permanent criminal record. My brother was really mad at me, and he didn't talk to me for a long time. When he did, he was cold and distant. I felt guilty for getting him in trouble, but I knew I had done the right thing. He put me and the whole family in great danger because of what he did. I'm glad I told my parents. It was a difficult decision, but it was the right one. It's not always easy to do the right thing, but it is necessary. In the end, my brother was able to turn his life around. He spent a few months in a rehabilitation center and came back a changed person. He's no longer involved in drugs, and he's more focused on his studies. We were able to repair our relationship and became closer because of it. I believe he even understands why I did what I did. This happened almost 10 years ago. It was a weekend in September when my parents decided to attend a friend's dinner party, leaving me home alone in our apartment. We lived in the city, right in the downtown core. So since I was only 13 at the time, I was not supposed to go out alone, especially at night. It wasn't a big deal for me to be home alone at the time, since it was just for an evening. I stayed up doing homework and practicing piano, but at around 10 p.m., the fire alarm went off. That happened now and then in my building, but it was always a false alarm, really more of an annoyance than anything else. Sometimes you can wait it out, and the alarm will just stop, but as the sound grew louder, I knew I had to take it seriously. I quickly got dressed and headed for the door. As I opened the door, I was met with a strange sight. The hallway was completely empty and still. I figured that most of my neighbors must have left already, so I was the last one. There was no smell of smoke, but the flashing red lights and fire alarm continued to pulse, and I knew I had to leave the building. I started down the narrow staircase, the fluorescent emergency lights casting an eerie glow over everything. I made it down to the ground floor, relieved to see that there was no visible sign of smoke or fire. But as I stepped outside, I was met with a chaotic scene. There were people everywhere, crowding the street and talking to each other. Fire trucks were pulling up to the building, their sirens blaring. I felt a little uncomfortable out there without my parents. There were many people around, but I didn't know many of them. It was a large building, and I was not the most social person. I tried to find a spot to stand, away from the chaos, but I didn't want to get too far away from the group. I was feeling very vulnerable. That's when I noticed a strange man standing near me. He was older, with a scraggly beard and shabby clothes. He was watching me intently. I tried to ignore him, but he came closer, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. He started talking to me, his voice low and insinuating. I didn't like the way he looked at me, and I tried to edge away, but he stepped closer and reached out to touch my arm. That's when Mr. Allen, one of my neighbors, appeared out of nowhere. He was a tall, burly man with a friendly face, and he lived on the 3rd floor. Mr. Allen was one of the only people in the building that we knew. He saw what was happening and stepped in front of me, shielding me from the strange man's grasp. Mr. Allen told the man to back off, and he finally slunk away into the crowd. He stayed with me, reassuring me that everything would be okay. He explained that the fire was probably a false alarm, and that we'd be back in the building in no time. But I was still scared and shaken. I didn't know how I was going to make it through the night. As the minutes ticked by, the situation began to calm down. The firefighters finally cleared the building, and surprise, surprise, there was no fire. My parents came home, and I was relieved to see them. I realized how lucky I was to have Mr. Allen there to help me. He was like a guardian angel, watching over me and keeping me safe. I never realized before how important it is to have good neighbors and a sense of community, especially in an urban setting. I still think about that strange man who tried to lure me away from the group, and I never saw that man again, so I'm pretty sure he didn't live in the building. He must have just been some creep who saw an opportunity and went for it. It was a sobering reminder that there are dangerous people out there, and that we need to be careful. This happened a long time ago. I was still in primary school, and I'm pretty sure I was around 12. It was summer vacation, and I was home with my older brother. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving us alone. We were excited to have the house to ourselves, and feel a sense of freedom that kids my age don't often experience. My brother, who was a few years older than me, was a little too cool to spend this time with his dorky younger sister. He made plans to meet up with his friends at the park, even though he was supposed to stay with me. I was a little disappointed he was leaving, but I understood that he wanted to spend time with his friends. After he left, I settled down on the couch and watched some TV. The hours flew by. Before I knew it, it was getting dark outside. I got up and went to the bathroom. As I was walking down the hall, I heard a loud noise coming from the living room. It sounded like the door had been opened. I thought my brother had come back early, so I walked over to see him. When I turned the corner to the living room, I almost fainted. It wasn't my brother at all. It was one of my brother's friends, Jim, who I knew was a real creep. I had problems with him before, and the other girls in the neighborhood had complained about him as well. My heart was racing as I tried to stay calm and think of what to do. I quickly locked myself in the bathroom. While I was in there, I could hear someone moving around in the house. I heard someone walking down the hallway, and then I heard a knock on the bathroom door. My body was paralyzed with fear as I heard a person say,
Hey, it's me, Jim. I just wanted to talk to you. Come on, we can hang out.
I knew this guy was bad news. He was always getting into trouble and had a reputation for being creepy. My brother had warned me to stay away from him, but I never expected him to break into our house. I was so scared that I couldn't even respond. I stayed silent and prayed he would go away, but he didn't. He kept knocking on the door and trying to convince me to come out. Then I did the only thing I could do. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could until my voice gave out. After what felt like hours, it was probably only a few minutes, I heard the sound of a police car approaching. Jim must have heard it too, because he immediately ran away. He must have thought I had my phone with me, but in reality, I had left it out in the living room. I heard the fading sounds of footsteps, and then I heard a door slam. I cautiously came out of the bathroom and opened the door to talk to the police. They came into the house and searched the entire place. There was nobody there, which was unsurprising to me. Then they told me that a neighbor had heard me screaming and called them. I never found out who it was, but I really wanted to thank them for the help. I was so grateful that the police had come, but I was also angry with my brother. He knew that guy was bad news, but he still left me alone anyway. I couldn't believe that he had put me in danger like that. I figured Jim was in the park when my brother was with his friends, and when he heard that I was home alone, he must have snuck away and did what he did. When my parents came back, they were shocked to hear what happened. They were furious with my brother and made sure he knew how serious the situation was. They also made sure to take extra precautions to make sure our home was secure and safe. After that, I never trusted my brother's judgment again. I knew he could be reckless and that he didn't always think things through. The really frustrating thing, though, is that Jim played the whole thing off like he was invited to the house. He was a friend of my brother's, so he said that he was invited and he was just waiting. It was my word against his, and he never faced any legal consequences for what he did. My parents did ban him from our house, though. This was over 10 years ago, and of course, I did eventually forgive my brother. He was genuinely remorseful, and technically no harm was done, although it was really close. I'm Crystal, and this happened when I was in the 9th grade. I got home from school at around 3:30 in the afternoon, and I knew it would be at least an hour before my parents got home from work. I usually spent that hour watching TV or doing some homework, but on this day, something was different. As soon as I walked in the door, I felt like somebody was in the house. It was just a feeling at first. I could sense a presence. Then I started to hear noises coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it might just be the sound of wind blowing through the windows, or the creaking of old wooden floorboards. But as I listened more closely, I heard footsteps. Someone was walking around upstairs. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Someone was in the house. Maybe they were trying to steal something. Maybe worse. I tiptoed to the bottom of the stairs and peered up. I saw the figure of a man standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at me. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could tell that he was tall and muscular. He was wearing a black hoodie, jeans, and light brown work boots. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was trapped. There was no way out, even though the front door was right there. I tried to back away, but my legs were shaking, so I stumbled. The man started to come down the stairs, and I knew I had to get out of there. Miraculously, my legs sprung into action. I turned and ran as fast as I could, darting out the back door. I sprinted across the lawn to my neighbor's house. My neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, was a kind old lady who had lived next door to me for as long as I could remember. I pounded on her front door, and she opened it. Her eyes were wide with surprise. I fumbled out the story to her. She immediately took me in. We sat in her living room, and she gave me a glass of water. As I sat there, trying to calm down, I heard the sound of a car pulling up and then speeding away from my house. I figured the man had left, but would he come back? I didn't know, but I was scared. Mrs. Wilson comforted me, telling me that everything was going to be all right. She called the police, and they arrived a few minutes later. They searched the house, but there was no sign of the man. He was definitely gone. We later found out that some of my mom's jewelry was stolen, and some other stuff too. All in all, it was less than $1,000 worth, so maybe I saved us a bit by scaring the guy away. Unfortunately, the man was never caught. For weeks after the incident, I was scared to go back into my house, worried that he might come back. I slept with the lights on, and was constantly looking over my shoulder. Eventually, the fear subsided, and I was able to move on. But I never forgot that day. I was always wondering what might have happened if I didn't run out of the house when I did. It was a close call, and I was glad I got out of there. This happened one evening when I was 13 years old, which was in the mid-1990s. I was home alone watching TV, and there was a knock at the door. It was already dark outside, and I couldn't see who it was through the small peephole in the door. But since the lights and TV were on, I knew the person on the other side knew I was there. My parents always taught me to be cautious when it came to strangers. They were especially strict about not letting anyone into the house when they weren't home, so I was apprehensive. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see that it was a man in his late 20s or early 30s. He seemed polite enough, and he explained that his car had broken down and he needed to use the phone to call for help. I was hesitant to let him in. My parents had always warned me about situations like this, but I also didn't want to turn him away if he really needed help. I asked him where his car was, and he pointed down the road, but when I looked outside, I didn't see any car in sight. I also couldn't help but wonder why he walked past the two houses right next to mine, which had visible cars in their driveways. I thought he chose our house because it looked like nobody was home. When I told him that, the man became agitated and defensive, which only made me more scared of him. We argued for a while. He insisted that he really needed to use the phone, but I told him to check with one of my neighbors. Finally, I decided it was best for me to just tell him to leave. As I shut the door and locked it behind me, the man started yelling and cursing at me. He called me all kinds of names. Remember, I was only 13 at the time. I stood my ground and refused to let him in. A pretty obvious choice at that point. I could hear him walking away, still shouting obscenities, and I felt relieved that the encounter was over. I walked around the house and made sure all the doors were locked, even though I was pretty sure they were already. After a minute or two, I decided to call my parents and tell them what happened. They were both concerned, and they told me to stay inside and make sure all the doors were locked, to which I told them that I already did. I did as they instructed, and spent the next half hour sitting nervously on the couch, waiting for them to come home. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night. My parents came home as soon as they could, and I was really happy not to be alone anymore. The next day, my parents talked to several of our closest neighbors. None of them had a visit from that guy. My dad was pretty sure that it was somebody scouting out the neighborhood for robberies. I noticed that all my neighbors had cars in their driveway at that time, so that would explain why he chose us. We also started to notice a strange car circling the neighborhood. I never got a good look at it, so I couldn't tell if it was the same guy, but it would make sense if they were connected. In the end, my parents reported the incident to the police, but nothing came of it. We never saw that man again, and life went back to normal. But a few weeks later, one of my neighbors, an elderly couple, were robbed. It's impossible to know for sure, but I think the incidents were connected. My name's Colin, and I was 15 years old when this happened. It was the year 2001, so you can figure out my current age if you want to. It was a typical summer day, and I had gotten home from school. I was in the basement playing StarCraft, my favorite computer game at the time. I still play it sometimes, actually. I'd been playing for about half an hour, and I was completely immersed in the game. Suddenly I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, and I assumed it was my mother coming home from work. I heard footsteps on the porch, which was right above where I was in the basement. And I heard the sound of the screen door opening, but not the main door. I wondered what was going on, so I decided to go upstairs and check. As I walked up the stairs, I heard the sound of voices coming from the backyard. I peeked through the curtains and saw two guys standing there, looking at the windows and talking in hushed tones. At first I assumed they were friends of my older brother, but then I realized that they were strangers. These guys were too old to be friends with me or my brother. They were at least 25. One of them was overweight with a gray sweatshirt, and the other one was around average size with a black t-shirt. Both had short beards. Then I saw one of them walk by the other window. I knew that something was seriously wrong. I kept trying to think of reasonable explanation, but there wasn't any. My parents would never hire a repairman or anything like that while I was home alone. I had to do something before they broke into the house. I went to the back door and looked out the window through the curtains. I saw the two guys standing outside, looking around nervously. One of them tried to open the door, but it was locked. He jiggled the handle twice, then I heard a loud pound on the door, as if he hit it out of frustration that it was locked. I didn't think they knew I was there, and I tried to stay quiet so they wouldn't know. I called my mom at work, and I told her what was happening. She immediately called the police and told me to stay inside. I went to my bedroom and tried to keep myself calm, but I was terrified. I could hear the guys outside trying to open the doors and windows. I decided to hide. I went into my closet and tried to stay as quiet as I could. I could hear the guys moving around outside. I was worried that they would break a window and come into the house, but that didn't happen. I guess they were worried about the noise. They wanted to find an unlocked door or window. After another 5 long minutes, I heard the sound of sirens. The police were close. I heard them yelling at the guys to get to the ground and to put their hands up. I came out of my closet and looked out my bedroom window. I couldn't see anything, so I went to my brother's room, and I saw the 2 guys being handcuffed and put into the police car. It was finally over. One of the officers waited with me until my mom got home, which was only another few minutes. Overall, this was one of the scariest things that ever happened to me in my childhood. I think every kid has nightmares about a break-in while they're home alone. I was lucky that these guys checked all the doors first. It gave me a chance to call the police. I've read stories where the robbers smashed a window or picked a lock right away. Luckily, I was able to get help before it was too late. I grew up in a small farmhouse that was nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by sprawling corn and wheat fields. It was the kind of place where the only sound was the rustling of leaves or the occasional chirping of crickets. One night my parents had gone out of town, leaving me alone in the house. I spent the night by myself. My parents gave me some chores to do, but it wasn't much. I spent most of the night playing video games and chatting with my friends. At around 11:30, I stepped out onto the porch for a cigarette. I sat on the porch swing, enjoying the cool night air and the stars overhead. About halfway through my cigarette, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw someone standing on the road in front of my house. At first I thought it might be one of my friends or a neighbor, but as I looked closer, I realized that I didn't know the person. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, with broad shoulders. He wore dark clothes, but I couldn't really tell much else. It was too dark to make out any details of his face, but something about the way he stood sent chills down my spine. Maybe it was just the circumstances that made it seem that way, though. The man stood there, completely still, as if waiting for something. There were no neighbors for miles, and I knew for sure it wasn't anyone I recognized. There was no car parked on the road either, which made me wonder how he got there. It was really confusing. I was super creeped out, so I got up and went back into the house. I went upstairs and brushed my teeth. When I was done, I looked out the window. That person was still there. He was pacing back and forth on the road. His steps were quick and forceful. It was like he was late for something. He was just walking back and forth. I didn't think he was doing anything illegal, just being creepy, so I didn't call the police. I decided to take a shower and then check back after. The man was still there, but now he was standing still again, looking at my house. I was beyond creeped out at that point. I couldn't go to bed with him out there. Who knows what he would do if I fell asleep. I called my parents who were visiting family over 5 hours away. When my dad answered, I told him what was happening. He thought it was a joke at first, but after a few minutes, I convinced him I was serious. He told me to call the police immediately. I hung up the phone and called the police, like he said. I told them that I needed help. The officer told me that somebody would be there soon. I sat there on my bed for a few long minutes. I looked out the window every few seconds, and the man had started pacing again. It took a little over half an hour for the police to arrive. My house was in a really remote area. The wait was agonizing, but I looked out the window and saw the police car, and I was really relieved. I went out to talk to the officers, but when I opened the door, I noticed the man was gone. When I talked to the police, I found out that they didn't see him at all. I was really confused by that. The only place he could have gone was into the wheat field across the street from my house. I couldn't sleep for that entire night. I kept thinking that the man would appear at the end of my bed, just standing there staring at me. That didn't happen though, and I haven't seen him again yet. There's no way I can explain what he was doing, or even how he got there without a car. It was seriously terrifying, and I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night. When I was 17, I had 3 dogs. Vatani, a Dutch Shepherd Pit Bull mix, Sarah, a Yellow Lab Whippet mix, and Kodiak, a Lab Dalmatian Greyhound mix. Vatani was 6, Sarah was 2, and Kodiak was 1, respectively at the time. Even though Kodiak was young, he had a deep bark and growled at any man or boy who came up to me besides my brother. Sarah was a calm dog who hardly barked or growled unless she had to, and Vatani hated all strangers because their original owners mistreated her. I was home alone one night. My mom and brother were on their way back from another city when it started raining hard. They decided to stay in a hotel so they wouldn't have to drive in the rain. Of course, I made sure the doors and windows were locked. At around 8 p.m., I noticed Sarah was growling. My heart dropped because, like I said, Sarah hardly ever barked or growled. I then heard a knock at the front door. I answered it, and it was the bishop from my church. I got really scared because my bishop was obsessed with me. I tried to play it cool and asked him, "Bishop, why are you here? It's raining." Then all of a sudden, he grabbed me. I yelled Vatani. All 3 dogs tackled him to the ground. I called the cops and my mom. She and my brother raced home. By the time the cops got there, my dogs had messed him up really bad. He was arrested, and my dogs were hailed as heroes. I don't have my dogs anymore, but I miss them a lot. It was a Friday night, and my parents had left for the weekend. I had the house to myself, which was something I was looking forward to for a long time. I planned to order takeout, binge watch my favorite TV show, and maybe invite some friends over. As I settled into the couch with my food, I heard a knock at the front door. I was taken aback, since I wasn't expecting anyone. I approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. I didn't recognize the person who was standing outside. He was a tall, thin man in his late 20s. He wore a blue plaid collared shirt and had a stack of papers in his right hand. He looked harmless enough, but given the circumstances, I was a little worried. I opened the door anyway. I don't actually know why. Maybe it was just curiosity, or just habit. He was very polite and well-spoken, and then gave me some kind of a sales pitch about something that I can't really remember. Something about our gas bill. I don't know. I didn't know why he bothered, because I was only 14 at the time. I obviously didn't make decisions like that. I closed the door and then went back to the living room. The rest of the night passed without incident. I watched TV, checked my social media, and eventually went to bed. But just as I was dozing off, I heard a strange noise outside. It sounded like somebody was in our backyard. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, peering out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I thought someone was there. I was going to call the police, but before I could, I heard a smash from downstairs. It could only have been a broken window. I knew that somebody was inside the house. I locked myself in the bathroom. The lock was pretty weak, and I knew it wouldn't have taken much to kick it down. I felt really vulnerable. I could hear the sound of footsteps downstairs. As I sat there in the bathroom, I realized that I left my phone on the nightstand in my bedroom. I had no way of calling for help, or even checking the time. Minutes passed that felt like hours, and I could hear the intruder moving through the house. I considered going out to grab my phone, but I was way too scared. I tried to make as little noise as possible, hoping that he wouldn't find me, but his footsteps were getting closer. He was on the upper floor now. There was a small window in the bathroom. I walked over and opened it. I had to stand on the towel rack to get up to it, but I managed to escape. I stepped out onto the roof and quietly closed the window. I sat there on the roof for a few minutes trying to decide how to get down. My mom had a large flower pot that was right underneath where I was standing. It was half a wooden barrel. It was at least 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. I jumped from the roof onto it, and it was enough to break my landing. I made it down without hurting myself. Once I was down, I started running away from the house. One of my neighbors is a good friend, so I ran there. When I reached my neighbor's house, I pounded on the door, screaming for help. The lights flicked on, and the door opened to reveal my friend's mom. "What's going on? Are you okay?" she asked, looking at me with concern. I tried to speak, but I was grasping for breath. I could feel the tears streaming down my face as I struggled to regain my composure. I finally managed to tell her what happened. "It's okay," she said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Come inside, and we'll call the police." She led me into the living room and handed me a glass of water. I sat there trembling as she called the police and told them what happened. They arrived a few minutes later. They searched my house, but the intruder was gone. They assured me that they would keep a close eye on the area, and that I should call them if I saw anything suspicious. I told them about the guy who came to my door earlier that day. They said that it may have been somebody scouting ahead to find a good target. He must have known that my parents were away. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed with my friend, unable to go back to my own house. My parents returned home the next day, and I told them the full story. They were understandably upset, but also relieved that I was okay. There was some stuff missing from the house, but it was minor compared to the experience that I had. It's been a few months since that night, and it still really scares me from time to time. We've installed security cameras and an alarm system, but I still feel scared whenever I'm alone in the house. This happened over 10 years ago, but I still talk about it sometimes. It's my go-to scary story for campfires. My mom started leaving me home alone when I was 12 years old. I guess that's kind of young, but I was mature for my age, and she worked a lot. Those are my excuses anyway. We had a 2-bedroom apartment in a large complex, just off a major highway. I was alone one night as usual, while my mom worked a late shift. I was watching TV, and slowly chipping away at some homework. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud banging noise. I couldn't tell exactly where it came from, but I thought it was a gunshot. I had never heard a gunshot up close before, so I wasn't sure. The vibrations shook my young body to the absolute core. It was like I had been hit by a car. It was really intense. I immediately jumped onto the floor and hid under the coffee table. I could hear commotion outside the apartment in the hall, but I couldn't tell what was happening. The gunshots kept ringing in my ears, and I was really scared. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing with thoughts of what could be happening outside. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't have my phone within reach. It was in the other room charging, and I was too scared to move. I just lay there waiting. Suddenly the sound of sirens began. I mustered the courage to look out the window. At first it was just one police car, and then more started to arrive. Soon there were at least 12 cop cars and 2 fire trucks outside my building. I could hear voices outside, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I started to feel sick to my stomach, and I wished my parents were there with me. I felt so scared and alone. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the commotion outside started to die down. I could hear police officers talking to each other, and the sound of radios crackling. I wondered what was going on, and if anyone had been hurt. Finally, there was a knock at my door. I froze for a moment. My mom always taught me not to open the door when I was alone, but if it was the police, then maybe that would be an exception. Then I heard a voice call out. He said it was the police and asked me to open the door. I slowly walked over and unlocked it. There were 2 police officers standing outside, and they looked very serious. One of them asked me if I was okay, and I nodded my head. I was crying at this point. He asked me if my parents were home, and I told him they weren't, but I gave him my mom's number. They talked to her on the phone, and waited with me until she got home. It turned out that my neighbor, who I had only seen a few times, was a wanted criminal. He'd been living there for a few months, and had killed at least 1 person. The police were called when his gun went off by accident. I was shocked, and I couldn't believe that someone like that had been living so close to me. The police officers told me that I was very brave for staying calm while everything was going on outside. The police sealed off the apartment for a few days afterwards. They used some kind of tape to seal off the door whenever the scene was left for a night or so. It left an adhesive residue on the door that never really came off. I lived in that building until I was 18, and every time I passed that door, I would see the marks and remember that night. I was 14 years old, and my parents had left me home for the weekend alone. They had gone on a business trip, and I was to stay at home by myself. My mom would often join my dad on business trips. His work had a strong social aspect, and it helps to have a guest. In the past, I would stay with my uncle on occasions like this, but he was busy, and my parents thought I was old enough to stay alone. I was excited for the weekend, and I planned on watching some TV and staying up late playing video games, all things I do normally anyway. The first night was normal. I stayed up late and watched TV with my best friend Ted, who lives down the street. Ted left at around midnight, and I went to bed an hour later. I was fast asleep by 1:30. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. I looked at my alarm clock, and it was 3:30 in the morning. There were strange noises coming from downstairs. It sounded like somebody was shuffling around on the floor. At first I thought I was dreaming, or still half asleep, so I rubbed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep, but the noises persisted. Despite this, I was so tired that I eventually just laid back down and dozed off. In the morning, I woke up to a strange feeling. The house was quiet. I was alone, so that was normal, but it felt weird. I can't explain exactly what I felt, but I knew something was off. I got up and went to the bathroom to wash my face, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. When I went downstairs, I couldn't believe what I saw. The living room was a mess. Couch cushions were strewn all over the floor. Drawers of the entertainment center were open, and papers were scattered everywhere. I felt a sense of dread in the pit of my stomach when I realized that my house had been robbed. I quickly checked the front door and saw that it was unlocked. There were no broken windows or anything. I realized the robbers had likely entered through the unlocked front door. I was pretty sure I left it unlocked. I felt guilty and foolish for that. The reality of the situation hit me, and I started to feel anxious. I didn't know what to do or who to call. I tried calling my parents, but they weren't answering their calls or texts. I was alone, scared, and vulnerable, and I was also worried that the robber would come back. I decided to call the police. They told me to wait outside until they arrived. I stood outside in my pajamas, shivering in the cold morning air, waiting for the police to arrive. When they got there, they let me tell them what happened for 10 minutes or so. Then they began investigating the scene. I watched as they dusted for fingerprints and took photos of the damage. It was a surreal experience, like something out of a crime movie. The police eventually left, and I was alone again. Over the next few days, I kept in touch with the police. They told me there had been a string of burglaries in the area, and they were working on several other cases that may be connected. That was surprising to me, because I thought our neighborhood was really safe. It was a small consolation, but at least I knew they were doing everything they could to catch those guys. In the end, the robbers were never caught. My parents were surprisingly understanding when I admitted to leaving the door unlocked. My dad said they would have gotten in anyway. I don't know if he believed that, or if he was just trying to make me feel better. Either way, I appreciated it. I was creeped out by the thought that I was alone in the house with them. I can't help but wonder what they would have done if I went downstairs when I started hearing those noises. Maybe they would have split, or maybe it would have been a lot worse for me. Who knows what they would have done to me? It could have been really bad. My name's Dennis, and I've lived in an apartment above a store for almost 5 years now. It's an old building, but it has character, and it's in a busy nightlife part of the city. I'm not much of a partier, but the area is filled with drunk people on the weekends, and even sometimes throughout the week. There's an unmarked door on the street right between two storefronts. It's pretty inconspicuous. Many people probably don't even notice it at first. It's always unlocked and anybody can get into my building and come right up to my front door without a key at all. There's one other apartment that I share this door with. The other apartment belongs to a pair of college students who I barely ever see. It was a typical Friday night. I had just returned from a night out with friends. It was around 1 a.m. and I was exhausted. I was ready for bed, so I went straight to my room and fell asleep. However, I woke up soon after to the sound of people in my living room. I initially thought it was just my roommate, but then I heard their voices and I knew it wasn't him. He was away for the weekend anyway, so I knew it couldn't be him. I got out of bed and tiptoed to my door to listen. I could hear two men talking, and they seemed to be drunk. I knew I had to act fast before things got out of hand. I took a deep breath and stepped out of my room. I saw two men standing there, and they were surprised to see me. One of them had a bottle of beer in his hand, and the other had a cigarette. They looked at me like I was an intruder. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound as tough as possible. The men just looked at me and laughed. They were clearly drunk and weren't taking me seriously. I could feel my heart rate increase, and I started to feel an adrenaline rush. I said, "What are you doing here? This is my apartment, and you need to leave now," I shouted. The men just laughed again, and continued to talk as if I wasn't even there. I could feel my frustration and anger building. I knew I had to do something to make them leave. "Get out of here now," I yelled, taking a step closer to them. That's when they got more aggressive. One of them pushed me back, and I stumbled into the coffee table, knocking over a glass. These guys were really drunk, and I didn't know what they were capable of. I ran to the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I don't think they chased me. I dialed 911, and within minutes the police arrived. They arrested the two men and took them away in handcuffs. I was shaken, but relieved it was all over. I talked to the police for a while, and I decided to follow through with pressing charges. They found that the men had entered through the unlocked door below my apartment. It seemed that I had forgotten to lock my door that night. It was an embarrassing mistake, and I could tell the police were annoyed with me. I can't say I blame them. I was tired, and I had been drinking too, but still, I felt dumb. This happened to me 7 years ago. I'm 20 years old now. My parents were away from home for a family emergency. I'm an only child, and whenever my parents left me home alone, I usually didn't get scared. It was the third night by myself. I was playing video games and eating junk food, and then I heard a knock at the door. I was wondering who could be knocking on someone's door at this late hour. I walked over to it, and I could see a man peeping through one of the small glass windows near the door. I could hear yelling. He was saying that he was really hurt and asked to come in. I asked what was wrong, and he said he had broken his foot. This seemed kind of weird to me. I asked him how he broke his foot. He told me he was taking a walk around the neighborhood and had tripped. He said his foot landed in an odd way. He was begging me and screaming. He said he would sue me if I didn't help him. I said I would call him an ambulance, and I told him to wait outside. After I said that, he said he would slit my throat and cut all my body parts in half. Then I grabbed my dad's shotgun, which he kept on the highest shelf in the kitchen. I also called the police. I told the man that the police were on their way, and he told me that they wouldn't make it in time. He was trying to bust open my dining room window. By the way he was hitting it, it looked like it was about to break. I quickly ran upstairs into my room and decided to hide under my bed. I called the cops again, and the operator told me they would be there in a couple minutes. As soon as the operator said that, I heard the window break. He must have found a big rock in my front yard. I could hear him checking all the rooms downstairs, and I heard him coming up the stairs. He checked my parents' bedroom. I could hear him rooting around through their closet. Then I heard him trying to open my door. I gripped the shotgun tightly in my hand and waited for him to break down the door. He was now kicking it as hard as he could. In a couple of hits, he knocked it down. I could see his feet. He tried to open the closet door in my room, which I had locked purposely to confuse him. He said,
"I know you're in here."
I was wondering if I should cut his legs or try to sneak past him and run out. I wouldn't be able to sneak out without making some kind of noise. At that moment, I'd forgotten I was under a bed, and I went up and hit my head, making a very loud noise. The man quickly turned around and said,
"Oh, trying to be smart with me, huh?"
Then I heard sirens. He said,
"Oh crap, you got lucky this time, but you won't the next."
He tried to run out of my room, but I grabbed his right foot, making him fall very hard to the ground. I was holding him with all my might. I heard the police rushing up the stairs, and they got a hold of the man. I came out with my shotgun, and the police were now pointing their guns at me. I quickly explained everything, and the police understood. Apparently, they found the man's van parked in front of my house. He had many sharp knives, duct tape, a camera, and rope. I can't imagine what he would have done to me if I hadn't thought to lock that closet door. The police called my parents and told them what happened. They came home 3 days early. My mom hugged me very tightly, and so did my dad. My mom told me that the man had been sentenced to 15 years in prison. We moved from that house a while later, and I had lots of nightmares about it. It took me a long time to get back to normal. I never stayed a night alone again until I moved out of my parents' house. I have 3 guns in my house now, just to be safe, in case anything happens again. This happened in 2013. This kid named Ricky moved in next door to me when he was around 12. For lack of a better term, this kid was pretty much a wuss. I remember one time he fell off his skateboard. He didn't even land hard at all, but he was crying his little heart out in my driveway. He was 16 years old at the time. Fast forward to when the kid was around 18. By then I was selling drugs pretty heavily, and he was one of my best customers. By then he was hanging out with some pretty shady people, which my parents obviously weren't fans of. My parents also didn't know that I was selling drugs, because I was pretty good at keeping it under wraps. Ricky was clearly a follower. He went from a skater/emo type to some kind of wannabe thug, which he just wasn't built for. My parents went to the Outer Banks of North Carolina every year for 2 weeks. They asked if I'd come and stay at their house while they were gone. I was excited, because their house was much better than the crappy little 1-bedroom apartment that I had at the time. Everything was going fine at the house. I had my on and off again girlfriend over all the time. There was quite a bit of drugs and alcohol going around. I was far from a saint back then. I'll never forget it. It was a Thursday night, and my girl had left a few hours ago. Earlier that day, Ricky had seen me out in front of my parents' house and asked me for a front. I told him no, because I never fronted anyone, and in all honesty, I'd been using a little too much of my own supply, so I couldn't afford it anyway. He didn't like that very much, and we got into an argument. I pretty much punked him in front of all of his friends. By then it was around 2 in the morning. I was obviously nowhere near tired, because of all the drugs I had done. I was sitting in the dark watching Netflix in the living room of my parents' house. There was a window to the outside, which I had opened. I paused the TV and was on my phone texting and on Facebook when I heard something. It was the screen of my window slowly sliding open. I know the sound. I had snuck in and out of that house numerous times growing up. I slowly got up and looked out the window. I clearly saw the screen moving, very slowly, up through the curtains. I walked up to the window, and as soon as I looked through the curtains, I saw at least 3 or 4 people scatter. I ran out front, but they were booking it down the street. I knew it was Ricky and his friends. I didn't see them, but I know it was those jerks. I didn't call the police or anything, because I wasn't exactly living on the right side of the law. I just went back in and locked everything up. The rest of the week went smoothly. I never told my parents about it, and I never saw Ricky again. I called him a few times, but he never answered. That was all the more reason to know it was him, and he knew that I knew. About a month went by, and I was watching the news. Ricky was on TV for murder. That blew my mind. He and his 3 friends went out of town, broke into some couple's home, beat them, tied them up, and then stabbed them. Then they burnt the house down after robbing it. They all ended up telling on each other, and Ricky got 35 years after testifying against his co-defendants. It makes me wonder what would have happened to me if I was asleep when they tried to break in. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me alone in the house. It was nothing new. I was used to having the place to myself from time to time. My friend Chris was going to come over. We would probably play some video games and just hang out. As I watched the minutes tick by on the clock, anticipation grew within me. Chris was always a good time. He was set to arrive soon, although we never agreed on a firm time. He just said he would come over after dinner. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I jumped up from the couch, assuming it was Chris. I excitedly walked over to the front door. However, when I swung it open, I was greeted by a stranger standing on the porch. Confusion crossed my face as I stared at the unfamiliar man. He was dressed in tattered clothes, and a disheveled beard covered his face. His bloodshot eyes seemed to be searching for something. He started talking to me, just small talk. I was really uncomfortable though. He said that he lived down the street, but I had never seen him before. After a minute or so, I noticed that the man was inching his way into the house. Before I knew it, he was standing in the doorway. He closed the door behind him, and then turned his attention back to me. I caught a whiff of alcohol on his breath. It hung heavy in the air. Something wasn't right. As if sensing my discomfort, the man's demeanor changed. He made his way further into the house, his eyes darting around the room. Panic began to rise within me, but I tried to maintain a calm facade, not wanting to provoke him. "Listen, mister," I stuttered. "I think you should go now. I'm expecting my friend to come over, and I don't want to get in any trouble." Ignoring my plea, the man reached into his pocket. His moves were slow and deliberate. My heart skipped a beat when he pulled out a knife. The room was silent, save for the pounding of my heart, which seemed to echo in my ears. Without a word, the man gestured for me to lead the way to the kitchen. My legs wobbled beneath me as I reluctantly complied. In the kitchen, he instructed me to sit in a chair, his movements still eerily silent. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of the situation. Thoughts of escape and self-preservation battled within me. I knew that any move I make could have dire consequences. With trembling hands, I sat on one of the kitchen chairs. Minutes felt like hours as the man remained silent, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to steady my breathing, hoping to calm the rising panic within me. And then, as if by some stroke of fate, the sound of sirens hit my ears. They continued to grow louder. I was pretty sure they were coming for me. Police rarely come to my neighborhood. The police burst into the house, and I felt tremendous relief. The intruder's eyes widened with surprise. His grip on the knife loosened for a fraction of a second. It was the opening the police needed, they swiftly moved in and disarmed the man. He was arrested and taken away. My parents came home as soon as they heard. I later found out that Chris saw the man enter my house from across the street. He was only seconds away. When he saw that, he went home and told his parents. They called the police, who saved me. I don't even want to think of what would have happened if Chris was just a few minutes earlier or later. Maybe we both would have been screwed, or maybe one of us would have had the sense to look out before opening the door. The following happened when I was 14 years old. My parents had gone out for the weekend. I'm 17 years old now, so it was a few years ago. I couldn't wait to have the house to myself. My parents weren't bad or anything, but I was looking forward to having some time to myself. Little did I know that this weekend would turn out to be one of the scariest experiences of my life. It was Friday afternoon, and my parents had left for their trip while I was at school. As soon as I got home, I ran upstairs to my room and turned on my Xbox. I was talking to some of my friends in the game. I didn't know any of them in real life, we just got together online to play. I ordered pizza and settled in for a night of gaming. At around midnight, I was still playing, and I heard a strange noise outside. It was a rustling in the bushes, or trees. I dismissed it as the wind, and went back to my game, but the noise persisted, and it was getting louder. I paused the game, and listened carefully. I looked out my second-story window, and saw a shadow moving around at the side of the house. It looked like the outline of a man. He was in our yard. There was a fence and a gate around our yard, so it was not normal for a stranger to be out there. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang at the front door. I had never been so scared in my life. I slowly crept down the stairs to the front window and peered out. I couldn't see anything, but I heard more noises coming from outside. I didn't know what to do. I was alone, and someone was trying to break into my house. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to waste their time if it was nothing. The noises stopped for a while, and I started to calm down a little. But then I heard footsteps coming from outside again. I opened the front door and looked around, but I couldn't see anything. I walked around outside for a minute or two, and then I went back into the house. I was slightly more relaxed after that. I walked up the stairs, looking forward to playing a few more games before bed. After I put on my headset, I thought I heard a noise from my parents' room. Maybe I was just paranoid from before, but I decided to check anyway. I peeked around the corner into my parents' bedroom, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the darkness. My body was shaking, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, but I was too afraid to make any noise. I backed away slowly, trying to get out of that room without being noticed. Suddenly, the man turned around and looked straight at me. I froze. My eyes locked with his. He was about average height, and he wore a large winter jacket and blue jeans. He started coming towards me, and I turned to run. I ran down the stairs and out the front door. I didn't stop until I was a few blocks away. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The police arrived, and we went back to the house. They searched the place and found the intruder. He was still in my parents' room. They took the man out, and they put him in the back of a police car. He looked straight at the ground the whole way there. The police stayed with me for the rest of the night. My parents came back as soon as they could, the next day. They were shocked when they heard what happened. We spent the day cleaning up and repairing the damage that the intruder had caused. I couldn't sleep at night for a while, and every little noise made me afraid. I was scared to be alone, and it took me a long time to feel safe again. To this day, I don't know why he broke into our house that night. It could have been some random burglar, or someone who had been watching our house for a while. All I know is that I never want to experience anything like that again, It's a memory that will stay with me for a very long time. I was home alone one night when I was 15 years old. It was a typical evening, and I was in my room watching YouTube videos on my laptop. The glow of the screen lit up my face as I zoned out watching. Suddenly, I could hear faint footsteps downstairs. Nobody was expected home for hours, so I was worried. I paused the video and strained my ears to listen, hoping that it was just my imagination. But there it was again. A distinct sound, like somebody pacing around back and forth. My mind raced and imagined all sorts of scenarios. I feared the worst. There had been some break-ins in the area, and I was feeling paranoid. I was scared, but too curious not to check it out. I tiptoed out of my room. The creaking floor beneath my feet made me cringe. I slowly descended the stairs, my hands gripping the banister for support. The house seemed unusually quiet, and the footsteps had stopped. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I peeked around the corner, and my eyes bewildered in shock. There in the dimly lit living room stood a man dressed in shabby clothes, seemingly unaware of my presence. He was walking again, just pacing aimlessly, it seemed. I wanted to leave the house, but I didn't think I could make it past the man to get to the door. I know it's the dumbest thing in every horror movie, but I went up the stairs. I had left my phone up there, and I figured I could use it to call for help once I got it. When I was back in my room, I grabbed my phone and opened my closet door. Then I went in and closed it behind me. With trembling hands, I fumbled with my phone and dialed 911. My voice quivered as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. She assured me that help was on the way and instructed me to stay hidden until the police arrived. Time seemed to slow down as I waited in that cramped closet. My mind raced with thoughts of what could happen. The minutes felt like an hour. Finally, I heard banging on the door. It must have been the police. Then I heard the door slam open, and several officers must have entered. Not long later, one of them entered my room. The police informed me that they had arrested the man, but they were unable to determine his motive for breaking into my home. There was no sign of theft and no apparent reason for his intrusion. It remains a mystery to this day. I have no idea what he wanted or what he might have done to me. Lucky for me, I'll never find out. This incident happened just post-COVID. My uncle decided to relocate with his family to a different city due to job-related reasons. Before this shift, they had been house hunting for some time and found one that suited them. But at the last minute, this is just a week before relocating, the owner informed them that they had a no pets policy. Therefore, they were forced to hastily choose another house, which wasn't in a very safe neighborhood. But it was closer to their workplace and school. They knew it was just a temporary home, and sooner or later they would find a better house. Fast forward to 3 months after they moved in. On this particular day, like any other, my uncle had left for work. My aunt, who was a teacher, was at school, but my cousin, who was 16 years old, chose to skip school because she was unwell. She had been resting in her room when she heard their 2-year-old dog Tuffy barking. She peeked through the window and saw a 50-something-year-old man standing on their front porch. He had somehow let himself into the main gate and was standing a few feet away from the German Shepherd, who looked terrifying, but was just like a big teddy bear. Tuffy was barking at him, but he seemed fearless somehow. My cousin opened the door partially and asked him who he was and why he was there. He just stood there smiling and staring at her, but didn't answer. That's when she remembered that their Wi-Fi wasn't working properly, so her dad had contacted the company, and they had promised to send someone to repair it that afternoon. So she asked if he was the Wi-Fi guy sent by the company. The man nodded. He had a small backpack and he was wearing an ID card of some sort. So she restrained the dog and let the guy in, although Tuffy wouldn't stop barking. My cousin led the guy to the upstairs room, where they had the Wi-Fi set up. The man just stared at the device for some time, before meddling with the wires. My cousin found it weird that he was acting strange, and he seemed like he wasn't very good at his job. She didn't want to question his ability, though. Just then, she heard a knock at the front door. She went downstairs to find that her dad had unexpectedly come home to pick up a pen drive that he left at the house. She told him about the guy. He was astonished that the guy had arrived sooner than expected. But before they could go upstairs to check on him, he himself was already walking down. He had a stunned look on his face at the sight of my uncle, who asked if the Wi-Fi device had been repaired. The man replied, saying that he didn't know how to repair Wi-Fi. He said that he was a salesman, and that he was there to sell some stuff. Needless to say, my uncle was horrified, and so was my cousin, who actually let this random sales guy into their house. He was still standing in their living room. My uncle was furious, and asked him why he claimed to be a repair guy, and walked inside the house. He said that my cousin was the one who let him in to buy his product. He then went into his sales pitch, trying to convince them to buy this product. My cousin was fuming with anger, and she screamed that she never would have let him in if she knew that he wasn't who he claimed to be. At this point, the guy changed his story and claimed that it was my aunt who had previously seen him pass by. He said that she asked him to visit later so she could buy something from him. My uncle by this time had had enough of this guy's BS and told him very clearly to get out of their house or he would call the cops. It worked. He walked out of the house, giving them death stares and cursing them under his breath. In the evening, when my aunt was back, she denied ever seeing a guy of that description, and she said she didn't even need whatever product he was selling. All in all, it was a terrifying experience for my cousin, who regretted not checking the man's ID card before letting him in. Fortunately, her father arrived in time to save the day. They did approach the cops, but nothing came about the guy. They never saw him again in that neighborhood, which they left a month later. But my aunt did hear from a neighbor that 1 year before this incident, a man claiming to be a sales guy had entered a nearby house and then stabbed a 60-year-old lady who was alone at the time. He then proceeded to rob the place. The lady did survive, but the culprit was never caught. They aren't sure if it was the same guy, but it's still scary that some random stranger entered their house, and only God knows what his intentions were. Luckily, they never got to find out. Like most people, I've been confined to my house because work is closed. That means more time to fix up my mountain bike and draw. It also means I'm alone 24/7. I live alone in a 1-story house in Virginia, near the Appalachian Trail. If you've ever listened to or read any hiking horror stories, you've probably heard about cults on the Appalachian Trail. I can assure you, they're real. Like I said, I live alone. I'm a 26-year-old man. I'm an avid hunter and marksman, and I love the outdoors. I've lived in this area my whole life, but I've never experienced anything like this. It was the middle of March when I started witnessing some strange things. First, it was just little taps on my window at night, which I explained away as just acorns or branches. Then it evolved into knocks on my outside door. Loud thundering knocks, enough to wake you up. Then it would stop, and I'd fall asleep. And the thing is that the nearest person is about a mile away. After a week or two, it stopped until last night. Last night was a super moon, and I woke up to knocking on my door. This time it wouldn't stop. I was paranoid, because it had been a steady knock for 5 minutes. I was scared enough to grab my AR-15 out of its case, and then I walked to the door. I keep the gun loaded at all times for my safety, plus nobody knows the combo to my safe, so there's really no reason not to keep it loaded. I grabbed the door handle and opened it. I looked out but nobody was there, so I closed it and started heading off to bed. But then, I heard more knocking. This time, there was something out there. About 100 yards in front of my house, I saw a person in a robe. like you would picture someone when you think they're a cult member. I yelled out, "Who's there? I'm not afraid to shoot." Then I saw more people step out of the woods all around. They were all wearing the same robe. They all stood in the middle of the yard and stared at me. I raised my gun up and shot right by their feet, purposefully missing them. They all ran off, and I went inside and prayed in bed with all the lights on. I didn't sleep at all. Let's just say I'm tired today. And if any of you cult members are reading this, I'm not afraid to shoot you next time. I carry at all times, since moving to where I live. But please note that the laws in my state for open carry are a little more strict than other states. In this case, you could argue that I had the right to show I was armed, but in that moment, I made the choice not to pull or even brandish my weapon. This happened about a month ago. For context, I'm a 21-year-old female with 2 dogs living alone. One of my dogs is a 95-pound pit bull, while the other is a 10-month-old corgi mix. This is all important later. I live in a lower duplex, where my front door faces an alley. This is where I take my dogs to the bathroom multiple times a day. That has been the case since moving in 7 months prior to this incident. At around 8 p.m., after a night full of Taco Bell and playing The Sims, I decided to take my 2 dogs out one last time before bed. I leashed up both of them and put on my coat, then headed towards the small grassy area in the alley. While they were doing their thing, I saw 2 lights above me go out, removing all the light from the alley all the way up until my back door. I took out my phone, turning on the flash so I could see my dogs. I still had to clean up after them. After turning my phone light on, I quickly looked up to see a man wearing baggy clothes and a hood. He was standing 20 feet from me. He must have been standing there a while, since my dogs didn't hear him walk up, and I didn't notice him at all. I did realize I was shining my light directly at him, and for a moment, I felt bad for doing it, since that was clearly rude. That was until I saw that he was glaring at me. I stood there uncomfortably for a moment, wondering if I should keep walking them, or try to turn and walk back. During this time, he decided to start walking towards me. I told myself that he could be trying to get to his car or something. That was until I realized that he was walking directly towards me, setting off both dogs. Being scared, I began to walk backwards, hoping to get out of his way, and definitely hoping that he would just walk past me, but he didn't. When I started to walk backwards, the man began to sprint. Not only that, but he then started chanting, and he did it loudly. I couldn't make out a word he was saying, but he kept repeating and chanting as he sprinted towards me. At this point, I kept going back and forth on taking action, but to be completely honest, I was scared to the point where I couldn't decide what to do. Thankfully, when I was in arm's reach, my dog reached his limit with this guy and lunged, snapping him out of whatever state of mind he was in. He then began to sing. That's right, the dude stopped only a few feet from me, smiled, then turned away from me, singing loudly as he walked past. Keep in mind that my dogs were still lunging for the guy. I stood there frozen, watching him walk down the alley and crossing the street to the next neighborhood's alley. I didn't move the entire time, because my front door was the next house from where I was standing. I didn't want him to see me walk in, so he would know where I live. Once I saw him cross the street, I ran, dragging both dogs behind me to my door. Then I locked it. I turned off all my lights and called the police. They said they would send someone to patrol the area. They didn't seem too concerned with someone crying, barely being able to explain what happened. After hanging up, I sat on the floor. I was on the phone with my mom. Pathetic, I know. Then I saw my motion sensor flip on. Keep in mind that you have to be directly in front of my unit for it to turn on. I freaked out and called the police again, asking if the officer was in my alley. Of course, she said no. There was no officer on my side of town currently. I explained that the motion sensing light turned on and off, indicating that somebody was out there. She told me to stay on the line, while I peeked through my shutters to see who was out there. You guessed it, the dude was pacing in front of my unit. When the dispatcher heard me panic and explain what I was seeing, she sent an officer over. She told me to turn my lights back on. We hoped it would scare him off, in case he planned to rob the place. While keeping my eyes on him between the shutters, I turned my lights on in my living room. This caught his attention. He stopped pacing and stared directly where I was standing. He wasn't moving. He began to mouth something quickly while staring. I assumed it was the chant that I had heard earlier. Thankfully, he turned away from me and kept walking. The dispatcher informed me that the officer was now in my area. I assumed the guy saw the officer, and that's why he kept walking. The dispatcher, who was very sweet and calming, informed me that the officers would find him and give me an update. I never heard back from them, so I'm assuming they caught him. I can't be sure, but that's what I tell myself. I've since called my landlord to get in touch with the power company to get those lights back on in the alley. However, it was no surprise that they haven't fixed them yet. I can't be sure if those lights went off by coincidence or not. I'm grateful for my dogs being there. Having a parent who works in the mental health field, I didn't feel that showing I was armed would do any good in the situation. I've been told that since he did not sound like he was in a good state of mind, if I did anything different, I might have triggered a worse response from him. I hope the guy found some help, but for the love of God, don't come back. This happened to me last summer. My mom and brother went to California for a week to visit family, so that left me alone with my dad. I had just taken him to work since his license was revoked. Then I went home to take a quick nap before I had to go to work myself. I woke up at around 9 a.m. and began getting ready for work when I started to hear some noises. I sat in silence, and then I heard the sliding door open, which was right under my room. I just stood in my room confused and kept listening. I then heard some heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, so I quickly went and locked my door. I backed away from the door, and what I heard next had me frozen in place. All of the cabinets in my parents' room began to violently open and close. This went on for a good 2 minutes, and then it all stopped suddenly. I got down on the ground and tried to peek under my door. I began to hear footsteps, and to my horror, I saw a pair of mangled, dirty gray feet stomp past my door. I quickly but quietly got up and pulled out my pocket knife, ready to fight whoever was on the other side of that door if they tried to get in. I then picked up my phone and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator that somebody was in my house. The lady told me that they sent an officer to my address. I waited for what seemed like forever. I stayed on the line with the operator, but the whole time, I was just waiting for the worst to happen. She told me the cops were here, but that I had to make my way downstairs to open the door and let them in. At that point, I pulled myself together and let my adrenaline take over. I made my way downstairs with a knife in my hand. Once I made it, I dropped my knife and ran to the officer. Then 2 more cops pulled up, and they told me to wait outside while they checked my house. After about 10 minutes, they came back, and what they said sent shivers down my spine. They told me that they checked every room and possible entrance, and found no signs that anyone had ever broken in. They told me to call again if anything else happened. I finished getting ready for work. I got there an hour late, and I told my boss what happened. Things went on as normal. I picked up my dad from work later that day, and I never told him what happened. I knew no one would believe me, and they would all just assume that I was crazy. It still puzzles me that there were no signs of a break-in, but I know what I saw and what I heard. To this day, I'm still confused about what happened, and the experience is burned into my mind. It wasn't until a few days ago when I heard a similar story which made my blood run cold. I couldn't believe how similar the event was to what I experienced, but it left me with even more questions. I still live in this house, and I hate it. I'm planning to move out soon, because there are times when I'm taken by fear in the comfort of my home. This happened to me when I was 14 years old. I found myself home alone one evening. It was getting dark outside, and everything was quiet in my neighborhood. Little did I know that this ordinary night would turn into a frightening experience that I would never forget. As I sat in my living room watching TV, I was enjoying the peace and quiet. My parents were away for the weekend, and my older brother was out with his friends. He was supposed to stay with me, but he went out anyway. Suddenly the doorbell rang. I wasn't supposed to answer it when I was alone, but I couldn't help but check. It could have been one of my friends, or maybe my brother forgot his key. It was the front door though, and my brother would have gone to the side. Either way, I was curious enough to check it out. I approached the front door and looked through the side window to see a man standing there. He was wearing what looked like a work uniform, and I could tell he was a repairman. His smile seemed a bit forced, making me feel uneasy. That wasn't the only thing wrong though. It was after 6 p.m. on a Saturday, so even if my parents accidentally made an appointment for something, it wouldn't be at that time. I also didn't see any car or truck in the driveway. I figured he parked on the street around the corner, but I didn't understand why. Instead of opening the door, I decided to talk to him through the window. I asked him what he wanted. He said that he was sent to fix a problem with our heating system, and said it needed immediate attention. Something about his manner made me feel uncomfortable, and I knew I shouldn't let him in without my parents' permission. To be honest, I thought it was a legitimate mistake. I thought he came to the wrong house, so I was genuinely trying to help him. He insisted that it was my house, and asked me to open the door. I stood my ground, and told him I couldn't let him inside without my parents being home. But he kept insisting, trying to persuade me to open the door. His words felt manipulative, and I was starting to get pretty scared. I told him my parents would be back soon, trying to scare him away, but he didn't budge. I knew he could get through that window if he really wanted to. I would have called the police, but my phone was in the other room, and I was too scared to leave the door. I thought that he would break it down if I left for a second. Next, the man started pounding on the door. It sounded like he was going to break it down. I was surprised by how weak it actually was. I could hear the wood splintering. I was about to run away and find my phone, when out of nowhere, a car pulled into my driveway. I was shocked because my parents were not due home until the next day, and my brother didn't have a car. I looked closer, and I could tell that it was one of my neighbors, Mrs. Jenkins. As soon as the man noticed the car, he turned and walked away. He walked around the corner and out of sight from my window. I still don't know what kind of vehicle he had. After he was gone, Mrs. Jenkins called the police. I was grateful for her at that moment. It was really lucky that she saw what was happening and recognized the situation for what it was. The man was about to break down my door, and I had no way to stop him. My parents came home the next day, and they were very concerned about what happened. We had to replace our front door due to the damage that the guy did to it. The lock was basically hanging out of it, and there were cracks all the way down. We didn't have any way to pursue the guy, because none of us saw his car, and there were no cameras that caught him.